Right now, like this very month, thousands of people have actively sought out and downloaded a really dense 19th century academic text.
Yeah, and it's all about, human sacrifice, ancient blood rituals, and the ritualistic murder of kings.
Exactly. And it's just sitting there, freely available on the servers of Project Gutenberg,
Right, tagged neatly and cleanly right alongside modern religion and atheism.
which is wild.
Uh,
We are basically looking at an artifact that completely shattered its own era and quietly built the foundation of ours.
it really did.
So today we're doing a deep dive into James George Fraser's monumental 1890 work, The Golden Bough, a study of magic and religion.
And the contrast is just jarring when you frame it that way,
Yeah, 'cause so.
Well, you have this hyper-efficient, sterile, modern digital infrastructure like the Project Gutenberg archive, the specific Library of Congress classifications, the metadata tags, and it's all being used to catalog the most visceral, primal, and often brutal behaviors of early humanity.
It's like an organized filing cabinet for the absolute chaotic origins of human thought.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
For this deep dive, we are specifically exploring the data, the conceptual overview, and the archival footprint surrounding the 1922 abridged edition of Fraser's massive study.
Because the original was, well, it was huge.
Oh, massive. And our mission today is to dissect how a comparative study of esoteric global mythologies, things like the priest-kings of Lake Nemi, or fertility rites.
Right, those dark, ancient things.
Yeah, how those managed to completely scandalize the polite, highly structured society of Victorian Britain.
Because beyond just the historical scandal, the text proposes a radical and honestly highly controversial theory of human intellectual evolution.
Right. It attempts to map the exact trajectory of how the human brain processes the unknown.
It really does.
And we are going to trace how that specific map, that theoretical timeline of human thought, kind of escaped the confines of academia.
Escaped and became a foundational text that profoundly influenced 20th century literature.
Yes. And birthed modern comparative religious studies. So, as you're listening, think about how you process a modern political succession, or how you interpret the themes of a psychological thriller.
Because Fraser argued that the underlying psychological wiring we use today is the exact same wiring used by the people who, murdered ancient kings to ensure the harvest.
It's intense. This deep dive is going to show you the DNA of your own modern storytelling and how society views its ancient past.
But we have to begin by placing ourselves in the exact historical moment this book dropped into the public consciousness.
Right, so the year is 1890.
1890. And the source text explicitly states that the publication of this sweeping comparative study scandalized Victorian Britain.
Which is a strong word. The word scandalized in an academic summary carries an immense amount of weight. I mean, we aren't talking about a polite disagreement in the university faculty lounge over dating a piece of pottery, right?
No, not at all. A scandal implies a structural disruption to the moral and intellectual fabric of the society itself.
So, to understand the magnitude of that disruption, you kind of have to look at the architecture of the Victorian mindset.
Yeah, this was an era characterized by a really rigid, unyielding hierarchy of truth.
Like, social conservatism and incredibly strict religious adherence weren't just personal choices.
Right, they were the load-bearing pillars of the British Empire.
Yeah.
They viewed their specific religious framework not as a stage in human development, but as the final, ultimate, divine truth.
It was completely separate from and infinitely superior to anything that came before it.
Exactly. And then Fraser publishes this work, and he introduces a methodology called comparative study.
He takes the most revered, unquestionable religious concepts of his own contemporary society, and he places them on the exact same analytical table as magic, superstition, and ancient fertility cults.
He essentially flattens the hierarchy entirely.
Right.
By examining religion as a global, comparative phenomenon rather than an isolated, unassailable revelation, he tears down the barrier between the quote-unquote civilized Victorian and the primitive ancient.
Now, before we dig further into the mechanics of how he did that, we need to lay down a very clear impartiality note for you as you listen.
Yes, very important.
As we explore Fraser's highly controversial grouping of magic and religion, we are doing so strictly to analyze his historical thesis.
We are neutrally examining the categories he created to understand how they provoked his 19th century contemporaries.
We are absolutely not taking a side. Nor are we endorsing or rejecting the idea that modern religion and ancient magic belong in the same comparative category.
Right. Our focus is entirely on the historical and cultural shockwave his taxonomy caused.
Because that neutrality is vital, since the shockwave was entirely about the taxonomy itself.
Fraser was telling the Victorians that their deeply held sacred beliefs occupied the exact same human continuum as the ancient agricultural societies that performed human sacrifices to make the rain fall.
So imagine someone today publishing a massive, highly researched, heavily publicized book claiming that our most sacred, unquestioned modern institutions.
Like, say, the concept of universal human rights.
Exactly. Or the foundational structures of modern democracy. Imagine a book claiming those are actually just slightly rebranded, localized versions of ancient superstitions.
That would be wild.
You think you are standing on the bedrock of modern enlightenment, and this author mathematically demonstrates that you are actually standing on the exact same psychological mud as an ancient fertility cult.
It strips away the illusion of exceptionalism.
Totally. The vertigo of that realization is profound.
Because the Victorians fundamentally believed they were the exception to history.
Right. And Fraser's comparative method aggressively argued that they were merely the latest data point in a very long, very bloody global history of human ritual.
But let me challenge the core of that scandal, though.
Okay, go for it.
Was the outrage truly just about the comparisons themselves? Placing a modern belief next to an ancient myth is provocative, sure.
Yeah.
But I look at the tone of the work. Wasn't the sheer audacity found in Fraser analyzing religion with the cold, detached, clinical eye of an anthropologist, rather than the reverent tone of a theologian?
Oh, absolutely. The discipline he applied was the weapon. Prior to this shift, the study of religion was the domain of theology.
Right, you approached the subject from the inside.
Exactly. With belief acting as the absolute prerequisite for understanding. But Fraser approaches from the outside. He applies the taxonomy of the natural sciences.
He categorizes myths, rituals, and sacred beliefs the way a Victorian biologist might, pin different species of beetles to a board for categorization.
Yeah, treating a living, breathing theology as a specimen on a slide implies the organism is already dead.
Yeah.
To a deeply religious Victorian, being studied clinically by an anthropologist isn't just offensive, it's an existential threat. It frames their living truth as an artifact.
And that clinical comparison is just the methodology. The methodology birthed the scandal, but the specific intellectual argument that fueled the outrage is the actual timeline of human progress he proposes.
Right, the controversial thesis. The summary text lays out Fraser's argument very clearly.
He traces humanity's intellectual evolution in 3 distinct linear stages.
Moving from magic, through religion, to science.
It's a grand, sweeping theory attempting to encapsulate the entire cognitive evolution of the human species.
And the definitions Fraser implies for these 3 stages are highly specific, and they fundamentally challenge how we define these words today.
So let's unpack the first stage, magic.
Based on the text's heavy focus on fertility rites and seasonal rituals, Fraser isn't talking about stage illusions or, fantasy.
No. He views magic as early humanity's first desperate attempt to directly control the forces of nature.
So magic, in Fraser's anthropological framework, is a highly pragmatic, mechanical endeavor.
It is proto-science. The ancient practitioner believes there is a rigid, direct link between their ritual and the physical world.
The logic dictates that if a specific fertility rite is performed flawlessly, the crops are forced to grow.
If a specific sacrifice is offered, the winter is compelled to end. It is entirely about cause and effect.
The human being is attempting to force nature to comply with human needs.
The ancient mind is looking at a chaotic universe and trying to invent a steering wheel. I do X, therefore nature must do Y.
It's an attempt at direct control. But then, according to this linear timeline, that system fails.
Right. Humanity eventually realizes that regardless of how perfectly the ritual is performed, they cannot actually force the weather to change.
The drought still happens.
The crops still fail.
So they are forced to move to the second stage, and the text explicitly notes the progression moves through religion.
Which is fascinating. The transition from magic to religion represents a massive psychological pivot.
It is the shift from the illusion of control to the strategy of appeasement.
Right. If magic is the human saying, I command the rain, religion is the human saying, I recognize my absolute powerlessness to command the rain, but perhaps there is a higher conscious entity who can.
Therefore, I must worship, beg, or appease that higher power.
Exactly. This perfectly explains the focus in the text on dying gods and sacred kingship.
You are no longer trying to physically force the season to change through a mechanical spell. You are mourning the god of vegetation who dies in the winter, and you are celebrating his resurrection in the spring.
Desperately hoping those higher powers look favorably upon your devotion and grant you survival.
The human ego suffers a profound defeat in this stage.
Huge defeat. We surrender the idea of our own agency against nature, and we project all that power onto divine figures.
Religion, within Fraser's thesis, is categorized purely as an intermediate phase of supplication.
It's basically the cognitive waiting room of human history.
The cognitive waiting room, I like that,
Wait.
which ushers in the final stage in his evolutionary timeline.
Science.
Positioned securely at the apex of human thought.
Right. The text positions science as the final step. But if you look at the mechanics of this progression, science isn't a continuation of religion.
No, not at all.
Science is actually a massive return to the original goals of magic. Oh, that's such a good point. Humanity gets tired of begging the gods for rain. They abandon appeasement and return to the desire for direct control over the world.
But this time, they do it through empirical observation and tools that actually function.
Yes. The underlying logic is a devastating critique of the middle stage.
Magic was a failed, ignorant attempt at science. Religion was a comforting, necessary pause when humanity realized their magic didn't work.
And then actual science finally arrives to successfully achieve what the ancient practitioners of magic were trying to do all along.
Right.
Crack open the mechanisms of the universe and command them.
But wait, look at this timeline again. Magic, to religion, to science. It feels incredibly convenient, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Fraser is effectively saying, let's survey the entire breadth of human history, from the dawn of consciousness to the present day, and wow, what a staggering coincidence, my specific generation of 19th century Victorian scientists has miraculously arrived at the ultimate finish line.
It is so convenient.
Isn't this timeline just monumental arrogance dressed up as objective anthropology?
It is the absolute zenith of chronological snobbery.
Chronological snobbery.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. The era of the Industrial Revolution, the era of Darwinian confidence. They truly believed they had solved the puzzle of human progress.
Fraser constructs a global timeline that inherently justifies the supremacy of his own culture's dominant worldview.
By labeling this a strict evolution from one stage to the next, he introduces a massive bias.
Right, because evolution implies that previous stages are obsolete. You don't retain your gills once you evolve lungs.
Exactly. By placing religion firmly as the middle stage, he is inherently arguing that an era of pure science will eventually outgrow the need for religion entirely.
He historicizes their deeply held truths. He classifies the Victorian religious framework as a temporary cognitive phase of the human species that is destined to be discarded.
He isn't just comparing their beliefs to ancient myths, he is predicting their extinction.
Okay, so we have this overarching, highly controversial evolutionary theory. But a sweeping theory is meaningless without the raw material used to build it.
We need to dissect the specific, visceral evidence that drives the narrative engine of the Golden Bough.
And the source text leaves no ambiguity about what that evidence entails.
The study explores mythology and religion across cultures, heavily focusing on fertility rites, human sacrifice, dying gods, and sacred kingship.
And it anchors this massive global comparative study with one incredibly specific focal point.
The priest kings of Lake Nemi.
Blood, soil, and crowns. These are the recurring, inescapable variables in Fraser's equation.
So let's analyze the thematic tissue connecting these specific elements. How does a fertility rite necessitate a human sacrifice, and how does that relate to a dying god?
Well, the text mentions seasonal rituals, which suggests a very specific, terrifying worldview.
Fraser saw ancient peoples linking the literal life and death of the earth, like the transition from barren winter to fertile spring, with the literal life and death of their gods.
And by extension, their rulers. We have to unpack the concept of sympathetic magic here. To the ancient mind functioning in Fraser's first stage, the universe operates on mirroring principles.
Right. They observed that life inherently requires death. The crops must die and decompose in the winter, so that the soil has the nutrients for the crops to be reborn in the spring.
Therefore, to ensure that the spring actually arrives, to ensure the gears of the universe don't simply stop turning,
Humans must replicate that cycle of death and rebirth. The macrocosm must mirror the microcosm.
So the dying god archetype isn't just a tragic story they told around a fire.
No, it is a functional, necessary mechanism for survival. The god must die and be resurrected so the harvest can die and be resurrected.
But because the god is an invisible, abstract concept, the society requires a physical, tangible representative on Earth to undergo the process.
Which is the terrifying origin of sacred kingship.
Yeah.
In this framework, the king is not a political administrator collecting taxes. The king is the living avatar of the vegetation god.
The king's physical body is mystically bound to the earth itself.
That is a horrifying promotion, honestly.
Seriously. If the king's vitality is directly tied to the fertility of the land, what happens when the king naturally ages?
Or what happens when the king just catches a cold?
Right. If the king weakens, the land weakens. If the king becomes impotent, the soil becomes barren.
The crops will fail and the society will starve. The sacred king cannot, under any circumstances, be allowed to show weakness.
Which creates the brutal logic leading directly to human sacrifice.
Yes. The society cannot risk the slow, natural decay of the king.
The old king must be violently, ritually removed at the height of his power, or the absolute moment he shows a single flaw.
And immediately replaced by a young, vigorous successor to ensure the continued vitality of the earth.
The blood of the king is the literal, required fertilizer for the soil.
It is a relentless, inescapable ecological logic. And the summary specifically highlights the priest-kings of Lake Nemi as the anchor point for this entire global theory.
The source doesn't detail the granular specifics of the rituals at Lake Nemi, but if you analyze the vocabulary we are given...
The title, The Golden Bough. The juxtaposition of kingship and sacrifice.
The phrasing alone implies a localized, dark, continuous cycle of violent succession tied intricately to the natural world.
But why structure the text this way? What is it about taking a hyperlocal, highly specific mystery, some ancient violent succession ritual at a specific lake in Italy, and using it as a skeleton key to unlock the entire world's mythological framework?
Why does that transition from the micro to the macro make for such compelling reading that it's still downloaded thousands of times a month today?
Because it solves the problem of abstraction.
How so?
Well, if Fraser had simply published a purely theoretical volume titled, The Global Archetype of the Dying Vegetation Deity, it would have remained an impenetrable academic paper.
True.
By starting with a highly specific, visceral image, a solitary priest-king standing guard by a lake, waiting in terror to be murdered by his inevitable successor, he creates a narrative hook.
He hands the reader a localized murder mystery. Why must this specific man die for the next man to rule?
He grounds the massive academic data in human paranoia and violence.
That's brilliant. He then expands that local mystery outwards, methodically demonstrating that this exact same bloody logic, this exact same psychological wiring, exists in seemingly disconnected cultures all over the planet.
He transforms comparative anthropology into a global detective story.
You solve the local murder mystery at Lake Nemi by realizing it is actually a global conspiracy of human psychology?
And that specific narrative power, the ability to turn raw, overwhelming anthropological data into compelling, archetypal storytelling, is exactly what facilitates the transition to the primary focus of our deep dive.
Right. We are moving away from the brutal ancient rituals themselves and looking at how Fraser's descriptions of them became the ultimate indispensable toolkit for modern writers and thinkers.
Because the text explicitly states that this work profoundly influenced 20th century literature and thought.
We need to examine the mechanics of how a dense, multi-volume 19th century academic text achieved that level of cultural saturation.
And the answer lies in a crucial piece of metadata from our source.
We are analyzing the 1922 abridged edition, which carries a reading E-score, 58.2.
The text categorizes this as a 10th to 12th grade reading level.
Noting it is somewhat difficult to read, but crucially, it is fundamentally accessible to the non-academic public.
That reading E-score is the critical vector for the book's influence. I mean, the original publication of The Golden Bough eventually bloated into 12 massive volumes. It was an overwhelming encyclopedic fortress of anthropological data. It was practically unusable for a novelist or a poet.
The 12-volume set was essentially a raw, unformatted database. The 1922 abridged edition acted as the API.
Yes. It translated the academic fortress into a manageable single-volume text.
It stripped away the exhaustive academic hedging and presented the raw, beating heart of the myths.
So let's break down the two-pronged impact of this accessibility, starting with modern religious studies and thought.
By placing this vast catalog of global myths under one comparative umbrella, Fraser provided the foundational architecture for modern religious studies.
Because prior to this, cultures were frequently studied in isolation.
Right. Fraser proved that disparate societies, separated by vast oceans and thousands of years, independently constructed the exact same archetypal narratives.
He provided the universal vocabulary. Concepts like the dying god or sympathetic magic became the standardized tools later scholars used.
To analyze human belief systems as a universal psychological phenomenon, rather than a collection of isolated historical anomalies.
He proved that human beings, regardless of geography, build the exact same spiritual machinery to cope with the fear of death and the unpredictability of nature.
He offered a unifying theory of myth.
But the impact on 20th century literature is where the cultural explosion truly happens.
We have to look at the timeline. The 1922 abridged edition arrives precisely when the global consciousness has been fundamentally shattered by the First World War.
Yeah. The 20th century opens with unprecedented mechanized industrial slaughter. The collapse of centuries-old empires.
The neat, optimistic Victorian worldview, the very worldview Fraser used to place science at the pinnacle of human achievement, was obliterated in the trenches.
The idea of a clean, upward trajectory of human progress felt like a sick joke to the post-war generation.
The modern world was perceived as chaotic, fractured, and deeply sterile.
The old polite stories no longer functioned. Novelists and poets were desperately searching for new frameworks, deeper and older structures to process the trauma and make sense of the modern wasteland.
And right at that exact cultural moment, the 1922 abridged edition of The Golden Bough drops into their hands.
Operating at a highly accessible reading level, handing them a complete indexed catalog of primal archetypal themes.
Fraser essentially, inadvertently, wrote the ultimate world-building sourcebook for the modernist movement.
It was a repository of raw psychological material. A modern writer didn't need to invent a resonant myth from scratch.
They could open the abridged edition, query the concept of the sacred king who must be sacrificed to heal a barren land, and apply that ancient structure directly to the trauma of modern Europe.
They were using ancient blood magic to diagnose the modern condition.
They used Fraser's catalog of primitive fertility rites to highlight the emotional sterility and the mechanical horror of modern city life.
The book handed literature a shared, mythic vocabulary.
It allowed authors to bypass the conscious, rational, scientific mind and tap directly into the deeply buried, subconscious fears and desires of the human species.
The ancient rituals Fraser clinically described weren't viewed as obsolete history by these writers.
They were utilized as active psychological blueprints.
There is a profound paradox here, though.
Tell me.
Well, Fraser wrote this massive study to prove that empirical science had successfully conquered and replaced magic and religion.
Yeah.
Yet his book ended up providing the exact magical, mythic structures that modern literature desperately needed to survive the psychological horrors of the scientific age.
Wow. Science gave the 20th century the machine gun, but Fraser gave them the mythology required to process the resulting grief.
He intended to write an obituary for myth, but he actually authored its survival manual.
That is so true. We've traced the trajectory from the scandalous Victorian reception, through the arrogant intellectual thesis, down into the visceral evidence of blood and soil, and up into the literary explosion of the 20th century.
So to conclude, we must bring the timeline entirely into the present day.
We need to examine how modern cataloging and digital archives treat this scandalous text right now.
The digital afterlife of a 19th century epic reveals exactly how deeply Fraser's ideas have saturated our current reality.
Let's look at the core metadata from our source. The book currently exists as Project Gutenberg ebook #3623.
It is freely available in the public domain.
And the staggering data point is this. It has 3,928 downloads in the last 30 days.
Nearly 4,000 downloads a month for a text published in 1890. You have to look at the psychology of the modern user there. In an era of infinite algorithmic entertainment, thousands of people are actively seeking out a dense, archaic catalog of human sacrifice and dying gods.
It really speaks to the enduring magnetic pull of those primal archetypes we discussed.
But the metadata itself is even more revealing than the download count.
Let's unpack how the Library of Congress and Project Gutenberg actively categorize this book today.
It is listed under Library of Congress class BL, which is officially defined as philosophy, psychology, religion, general, miscellaneous, and atheism.
That classification alone is a massive philosophical statement, lumping religion and atheism into the exact same foundational category.
And then look at the subject tags applied to the book.
It is tagged simultaneously with religion, magic, superstition, mythology, archaeology, and anthropology.
Analyze the juxtaposition of those tags. You have religion sitting directly adjacent to superstition and magic.
The exact grouping that caused the Victorian scandal in 1890. The Victorians were morally horrified that Fraser blurred the lines between their sacred religion and primitive superstition.
Yet, look at our modern digital metadata. The architecture of our information systems, how we tag, sort, and retrieve human knowledge, completely accepts his premise.
We tag it as both, without blinking.
The metadata proves that Fraser won the cultural war.
The fact that a modern user doesn't find it scandalous to see religion and superstition as adjacent equivalent search tags demonstrates that the secular anthropological worldview Fraser helped popularize is now the invisible baseline of our society.
It codifies the idea that religion is just one of many anthropological categories, rather than a standalone, unquestionable truth.
Our modern cataloging system views the study of religion and the concept of atheism as two sides of the same coin.
Because if religion is viewed merely as an evolutionary stepping stone between magic and science, as Fraser argued, then a massive comparative study of religion becomes a foundational text for a secular, historicized worldview.
We have permanently adopted his clinical gaze.
We really have.
The scope of the journey the Golden Bough takes us on is staggering. We started with the dark, visceral, seasonal rituals of ancient priest-kings guarding their lives at Lake Nemi.
We examined how merely comparing those brutal ancient practices to modern belief systems completely dismantled the polite, exceptionalist society of Victorian Britain.
We dissected Fraser's sweeping, highly biased theory of human intellectual evolution, the bold, linear claim that humanity progressed from the direct mechanical control of magic through the helpless appeasement of religion to finally arrive at the empirical control of science.
And crucially, we explored the massive cultural pivot. We saw how the 1922 abridged edition of this overwhelming academic fortress, functioning at an accessible reading level, inadvertently provided the exact mythic raw material that shaped 20th century literature.
And birthed modern comparative religious studies. It became the API for modern artists to process a fractured, traumatized world.
Culminating in its legacy today, where its original scandalous thesis is now quietly embedded in the very metadata and classification systems of our modern digital libraries, still being downloaded by thousands.
Understanding this text is not about memorizing 19th century trivia. It is about recognizing the DNA of modern storytelling.
Right. When you read a modern novel that relies on deep, primal archetypes of sacrifice and rebirth, or when you watch society attempt to clinically analyze and categorize different cultural beliefs, you are seeing the direct, active echoes of Fraser's work.
It provides the framework for how we view the evolution of our own minds.
It serves as a profound reminder that our current, supposedly sterile and rational worldview is built on layers and layers of older, darker, and deeply human attempts to force the universe to make sense.
Which leaves me with a final thought for you to consider as you step back into that modern world. Fraser constructed this massive timeline.
He firmly believed, with all the monumental arrogance of the 19th century, that humanity evolved from magic to religion and finally arrived at the ultimate, unassailable pinnacle of science.
But think about the mechanics of his own theory. The ancient practitioners of magic had absolutely no idea. They were just a stepping stone.
And the deeply religious Victorians were morally scandalized to be categorized as a temporary phase.
So it makes us so completely sure that our current era of empirical science is the final step. What entirely new phase of human intellectual evolution might eventually replace science, looking back at us exactly the way Fraser looked at the terrified priest-kings of Lake Nemi?